taking also remains below parity, and only 47% of data required to track progress on SDG 5 are currently available, rendering women and girls effectively invisible. Nearly halfway to the 2030 endpoint for the SDGs, the time to act and invest in women and girls is decidedly now. And so this side event will present the joint publication that is produced by UN Women and UNSD on the progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Gender Snapshot 2022. And this report emphasizes the data and indicators available and needed for monitoring the SDGs from a gender perspective, as well as the data gaps. The side event will also feature presentations from various stakeholders on the importance of disaggregating key statistics by sex and age using global data sets such as on gender and migration and food security, followed by a Q&A. So we hope that the event will foster dialogue on how to better mainstream gender across all the SDGs in this final decade of action. And again, we are really delighted to have you with us. I am joined here with three colleagues: Antra Bhatt from UN Women, Aina Satre from UNHCR, and Sarah Viviani from FAO. And so before we get started again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us to discuss gender and data and the SDGs and how we can become better advocates for mainstreaming gender data across the SDGs to achieve gender equality by 2030. And so in the interest of time, I will just go ahead and we'll go ahead and start with the presentations. Our first presentation will be by Antra Bhatt, who is a statistics specialist in research and data section of UN Women and very heavily engaged in the gender snapshot. And so I will pass the floor to you, Antra, and I'll also just provide a couple more details about her background in the chat. So thank you so much, Antra. I will pass the floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Heather. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second. I'm putting my presentation in. Okay, great. So hopefully everyone can see the presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm sure everyone's joining us from different time zones. As Heather mentioned, I'm delighted to present the progress on the SDGs, the annual gender snapshot, the 2022 edition. Our moderator already outlined why it's so important to look at this issue right now, so I won't go into too much details about that. But as we all know, the world is facing all these crises that we were just talking about. And these cascading global crises are actually putting the achievement of the SDGs in jeopardy, with the world's most vulnerable population groups disproportionately impacted. So in that sense, it's important to look at whether we are on track to achieving the SDGs, and especially Goal 5 and its intersection with the other goals. So we know that gender equality is a foundation for achieving all of the SDGs. We can't just look at Goal 5. We have to look at all of the goals and its intersections with Goal 5, and specifically with gender. So my aim with this presentation today is to show you how that distance to equal, the parity, is indeed quite long. And with only 8 years remaining to achieve the SDGs, time is actually quite short. But before I jump into the findings, just a very quick background on UN Women's flagship report. So this first one that I mentioned is the annual gender snapshot report, which we produced in collaboration with UNSD. Heather, our moderator today, is a co-author of the report, just like me. And the report presents the latest evidence on gender equality across all 17 goals, calling out the long road ahead to achieve gender equality. It's the only report in the UN system that takes a gendered approach to the assessment of all of the SDGs. Apart from this publication, from time to time, we also publish some spotlight papers, where each paper is a review of one of the 17 SDGs. And we showcase here some data sets with multi-level data disaggregation by sex, age, and other relevant characteristics. I'll leave you with some links at the end of the presentation so you can deep dive, but let's get into the material right away. So for Goal 1, what we saw is that by the end of 2022, around 383 million women and girls were living in extreme poverty, which is living on less than $1.90 per day, compared to 368 million men and boys. And if current trends continue, in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, more women and girls will live in extreme poverty by 2030 than they do today. And before moving to the next slide on goal 2, let me also say that the report looks at poverty at different thresholds at 320, 550, all the different poverty lines. And we see a similar message that women are facing a greater exposure to poverty, and much needs to be done about that to bring us back on track. Countries barely had a chance to recover from the pandemic. We saw the war in Ukraine erupt. There was a limiting of supplies of wheat, fertilizers, which propelled a lot of inflation. What we are seeing as a result of this is that many more women and girls are going hungry. And my colleague from FAO will be talking more about this, but just a quick fact for you. The gender gap in food insecurity, it increased from nearly 2 to over 4 percentage points between 2019 and 2021. So we clearly see the need for thinking about the gender aspects when we are looking at goal 2. Coming to goal 3, devastated health systems, they have left poorer women without care and in worse physical and mental health. Women's health is more important than ever, but it's sorely neglected. We also have legal restrictions, including the criminalization of abortion most recently, which continue to compound the challenges women face in accessing safe sexual and reproductive health care. Today, over 1.2 billion women and girls of reproductive age, they live in countries and areas where there is some restriction on access to safe abortion. And what we really need is a prioritization of sexual and reproductive health and services, but not enough attention is being placed on women's health. For goal 4, over 2 years into the COVID pandemic, we see that the schools have largely reopened, but we still see sizable impacts on girls' education and learning. We are seeing additional conflicts that have happened, wars, and renewed efforts in some countries to keep girls out of school, to perpetuate gender gaps in access to school and learning. Nearly 130 million girls are out of school globally. And we are also seeing increased adolescent pregnancy during COVID-19, which is further threatening girls' education. In fact, just as an example, a study in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and the United Republic of Tanzania, it found that 56% of adolescent girls from hard-to-reach populations who had dropped out of school early in the pandemic, the main reason for that were that they were currently or recently pregnant. For goal 5, which speaks directly to achieving gender equality, we see that at the current rate of progress, and this really speaks to the theme of the discussion today, it will take about 286 years to close gaps in legal protection and remove discriminatory laws, 140 years for women to be represented equally in workplace leadership, and at least 40 years to achieve equal representation in national parliaments. Thinking about child marriage, if we really want to end child marriage by 2030, progress must be 17 times faster than in the recent decade. So as you can see, a lot needs to be done for this particular goal. COVID has also exacerbated gender gaps and led to an estimated 512 billion additional hours of unpaid childcare globally for women. But nearly 60% of countries and territories did not take any measure to support these increases during the pandemic. In goal 6, the main storyline that we focused on this year was related to water stress. We are seeing that more and more people are living in conditions where the demand for water is clearly outstripping its supply, and where access is limited, women and girls must often walk long distances to collect water. As an example, in Iraq, where the water stress is really high, it's about at 80%, and where 30% of the rural population has no improved drinking water on premises, women spend up to 3 hours per day just collecting water. For goal 7, we are seeing that most women and girls without clean and affordable access to energy live in sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Southern Asia, and Southeastern Asia, and more than half are in fragile or conflict-affected countries. We are also seeing that the unavailability of energy is having impacts on women's health. For example, in South Sudan, where the maternal mortality ratio is 1,150 per 100,000 live births, women often give birth by candlelight since generators have limited capacity and power outages are routine. Goal 8, which is so important because everyone needs concrete economic resources for their survival. We see that fewer working hours, lower pay, and unfair burdens of unpaid care, they are all stalling women's prospects in labor markets. And women's labor participation in 2022 is projected to remain below pre-pandemic levels in 169 countries and areas. It's about at 50.8% compared to 51.8% in 2019. In goal 9, globally, we see that women hold only 2 in every 10 science, engineering, and information and communication technology jobs. At the 20 largest global technology companies, women hold only 1 in 4 leadership positions. Women inventors, they make up only 16.5% of the inventors listed on international patents globally. Bringing women and other marginalized groups into technology, it results in more creative solutions, as we see from the evidence, and it has greater potential for innovations, but we are not seeing that happen. For goal 10, and I know that my colleague from UNHCR will be talking more about this and the intersections of goal 10 with goal 5, so I won't go too much into details into this, but we are seeing that some 44 million women and girls were forcibly displaced by the end of 2021. And of these different groups, an estimated 12.4 million, a third of whom come from Northern Africa and Western Asia, are refugees. Goal 11, it aims at creating sustainable cities and societies and communities, but we don't see these cities to be amenable to women. Just like the moderator said at the beginning of this session, that we are seeing that violence, even in public spaces, is increasing. In a survey of 55 countries, 18% of women said sexual harassment was quite frequent or very frequent in their community, compared to 15% pre-pandemic. And other threats that are commonly being reported are racist behavior, street violence, and even the various rapid gender assessments that UN Women has run in 13 countries. They show that 49% of women in urban areas, so almost half, feel less safe walking alone at night since COVID-19. On the climate goals, there's always a challenge in terms of what we can say there. We are seeing impacts on women and girls, but there's never enough data. But from the data that we have, a few examples. A study in Botswana, for example, found that 56% of girls reported traveling longer distances than usual to fetch water due to climate change and the disappearing water bodies. In Somalia, this example really tells you the interlinkages between goal 4 and the climate goals. We saw that when families migrated from rural to urban areas in 2018-2019, as a result of floods, drought, and conflict, girls' enrollment rates dropped from 45% to just 29%. And in contrast, boys' enrollment rates actually increased. So just a very concrete example of the intersection between the climate goals and goal 4 in education. Coming to goal 16, equal representation is a goal and a conduit of most peaceful and just societies, but all we see is a chronic underrepresentation of women in leadership positions. Women's representation in public administration in fragile and conflict-affected countries is half the global average. Similarly, political institutions are far from achieving gender parity, particularly at the highest levels of executive and legislative power. Finally, for goal 17, which is the last goal, we see that allocations to programs where gender equality is the main objective, they only constituted about 4.6% of the allocable ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance, in 2020. And really what we need is stronger international cooperation at this point, especially to finance gender equality, to combat these multiple interlinked global crises that put lives and well-being of women and girls at risk, but we are not seeing that. To wrap up, what I also wanted to emphasize very quickly is that we include a tracker in the report on how the world is doing on each of the indicators and sub-indicators of goal 5, and tells us whether we are really on track to achieving gender equality by 2030, also the topic of the session today. First of all, huge data gaps. Only 47% of the data required to track progress on the SDGs is currently available. And based on the available data, 28% of SDG 5 indicators and sub-indicators are very far from target, and we only have about 12% that are at target met or almost met. So a very depressive outlook overall. To summarize, the report shows women and girls and other vulnerable populations are bearing the brunt of devastating social and economic fallout. Women and girls are struggling against a disproportionate share of job losses, increased care work at home, derailed schooling, intensified risks of domestic violence, and other forms of exploitation. So what we really need today is more investment in women and girls, more investment in gathering timely, high quality and disaggregated data by sex, Building forward differently and better will hinge on placing women and girls at the center of all aspects of public policy. We need to acknowledge that the challenges are large. There have been centuries of discrimination, and gender equality inequality is not going to disappear overnight, but we really owe it to ourselves to push forward in all areas and spheres of gender equality. So this is just the tracker, but I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. And I just want to end with this final slide where I'm including some resources for you all. We'll circulate the presentation later today to all of the attendees, and would be great if you can go through these resources at your own ease. Please feel free to widely disseminate amongst your networks. Thank you very much to all of you for your time today, and happy to answer any questions about the report. With that, over to you, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antra. It's always hard to go after that because some of the data points are very sobering. Actually, there is a quick question from the chat that I wanted to see if you wanted to address now. Can you speak to why there is a lack of information for Goal 5, or just some of the elements that are limiting the data availability for this goal?
Sure. Thank you, Heather, for that question. So I'll answer quickly on that. I think the issue is that what we try to do for the publication is to look at data that is available in the SDG indicator database. So that data which is being reported by countries' official statistics on each of the indicators that are part of SDG 5, and then to see where we are at with those. So what we see is that for many of the indicators, we have seen some progress where they were initially maybe tier 3 and they've moved with like better data availability. So we see data availability is improving over time. But honestly, the main reason, to just pick an example, is 541, which is on time use. We have seen that countries are not really investing in time use surveys. We see over and over again that women and girls, we are saying, are doing so much of the unpaid care and domestic work. And still we have so many countries that don't even run time use surveys within a 5-year mark. Sometimes it's 10 years, 20 years. So we don't really have investments in gender data at the country level, which really prevent us from telling a full and complete picture. So that's what we need here. And that's why we are here today, to advocate for more and better gender data at the country level.
Thank you so much, Antra. Really appreciate it. So next we will go to our next presentation from Aina Satra, who works in UNHCR in the Global Data Service and is responsible for external statistical partnerships and engagement. And her presentation will focus on SDG 10 and also the intersections with SDG 5. I will add some additional details about her bio in the chat as well. And Aina, I pass the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for the introduction. Now it's my turn to share my screen. Hoping that it comes up. There you go. So I think we can skip this slide. I'll try to provide as already said, I work for UNHCR, that's the refugee agency. So I'll start by trying to provide a global overview of the statistics on forcibly displaced. I'll also talk to UNHCR's role in collecting the statistics. I'll provide some data examples on the intersection between gender and forced displacement, and also some efforts on how to improve official statistics in this area, and especially then talk to the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics. And just as I have the chance, in the upcoming UN Statistical Commission, the EGRIS, the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics, have submitted recommendations on statelessness statistics for endorsements as well. So everyone who's interested in that can follow that when the commission is on. This is a snapshot of our global trends. That's the annual reporting on forced displacement statistics. It comes out in June and reports on the figures on global displacement for the previous year. UNHCR's role in this is to compile official statistics globally on the combined sex and age distribution of the population covered by its mandate, which includes refugees, asylum seekers, persons displaced by conflict and violence in their country, and stateless person at the end of each year, and also sourced from both UNHCR's registration system, but also from host governments. We also get data based on estimations from alternative sources, as well as available registration data and sample surveys. But this is also a sobering picture. The availability of demographic data varies greatly by population group and by country of asylum. And we still have a million not accounted for in terms of age and sex. Demographic data by age and sex is available for 84% of refugees at the end of 2021. So just to highlight again what Heather said in her opening, that demographic data by age and sex is necessary to achieve and measure progress on SDG 5. And we need that for all the groups included or affected by forced displacement, including IDPs, refugees, returnees, asylum seekers, and stateless. UNHCR works closely with UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, but also host governments and others to improve the work. You see the figures here. I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into some of them. So the global displacement figure actually exceeded 100 million in 2022. This does include all the people you see listed here, and also the recent events in Ukraine. Of these, as was mentioned also in the overview of the snapshot report, 44 million women and girls were forcibly displaced by the end of 2021. Some 48% of people displaced across borders, meaning refugees, are estimated to be women and girls. There are proportionally more women and girls among refugee populations living in West and Central Africa. We have an estimated of 54%. In preparing for this talk, I did do some research to dive deeper into the intersection between gender and forced displacement, and of course had a look at the report that we're discussing today, but also had a chance to read some work done by our colleagues in Asia Pacific, together with UN Women on the situation in that region, and also discussing a bit with the colleagues from our education team. And just to give you some insight into some of these reports, the structural and systemic discrimination against women and girls persists around the world. While income inequality narrowed in some countries before the pandemic, this has now reversed. Vulnerable groups of women and girls, including migrants, refugees, internally displaced people, are bearing the brunt of the social ills that plague today's world, including climate change, war, conflict, and human rights violations. Although all forcibly displaced and stateless people have in some way been affected by COVID-19, their experiences vary based on age, gender, and diversity characteristics. In many countries, forcibly displaced women and girls have been particularly impacted, with the available data pointing to more incidents of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation. Limited access to information and support services during the pandemic have intensified these risks. And then we have some data points. According to an assessment conducted in East Africa, West Africa, and the Great Lakes region, 73% of forcibly displaced women interviewed reported increased cases of intimate partner violence. This is reported in UNHCR's latest global trend. This trend is evident in other regions too, with women in Jordan, 69%, and Afghanistan, 97%, also reporting increased gender-based violence since the start of the pandemic. Child, early and forced marriage is another concern, as evidence demonstrates heightening risk and forcibly displaced adolescent girls. UNICEF estimates that over the next decade, 10 million additional child marriages may occur as a result of the pandemic. Then some findings from the UN Women and UNHCR report, with a special focus on the recent events in Afghanistan. The protracted conflict in Afghanistan, coupled with the recent Taliban takeover and the severe droughts the country has endured in recent years, have worsened poverty and food insecurity. Widened gender-based inequalities have taken a toll on the safety of Afghan women and men. Almost all Afghans in need of international protection, fleeing to Pakistan and Iran in 2021, cited violence and insecurity as a key reason for fleeing. The second most reason was specific security threats, which was cited disproportionately by groups with more women and girls. In Iran, where the reasons for displacement included discrimination among the response options, more women and girls were also among the groups that fled because of this reason. And then some data related to education. The experience of displaced children are diverse. The way displacement affects their schooling varies depending on their age, gender, disability status, and other characteristics. Without proper age and sex disaggregated data, we won't be able to know exactly what the educational needs of IDP and refugee children are. Preschool age children have different needs from primary, secondary, and tertiary students. Boys and girls also differ in terms of educational interest, learning habits, and protection needs. Refugee girls face further barriers arising from social norms and poverty, among other factors. In 2019, the gross enrollment rate for refugee girls in primary school in Pakistan was 70%, compared with 92% for refugee boys. In comparison, the national rate in Pakistan stood at 89% for girls and 100% for boys at the same year, in the same year. This is internal UNHCR data, but also from World Bank sources. So what do UNHCR do to improve data and sex disaggregation of its statistics? We do work with country level to improve country level estimations. And just to give an example of how successful this work can be, recently we did do work with national colleagues in Iran, and we estimate the demographics of the refugee population of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Given the size of this refugee population, the overall coverage of demographics for refugee globally increased by 4% from previous years. And we now stand at 84%. And this is something that we are planning to also expand to other countries with a large refugee population. We also do work on refining UNHCR demographic model. In interest of time, I'm not going to go into this quite technical work, but there is a reference here for people that have a special interest in this work. And as we said earlier, the presentations will be shared. But lastly, but maybe also most important, we work with governments to improve their official statistics and to build capacity in the area of forced displacement through the expert group on refugee, IDP, and statelessness statistics, the IGRIS. We also do work through the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, the IDAC, and also in the expert group on migration. Because as we know, having forcibly displaced in national data collection exercises is key to collect this type of data. So if I still have time, I would like to say a few words about the work of the IGRIS group. Before the IGRIS was established, there was no statistical framework to guide countries in their data collection on refugees, IDPs, and now also stateless persons. Most of the data on these populations were from operational data sets. And little was from official statistics. The group received strong interest from the UN Statistical Commission to start work in this area, and it was agreed to start preparing international recommendations on refugee statistics. We also see that there is a growing interest in the political landscape to improve statistics in the area, knowing that this statistics also will feed into policy development, programming, and projects. So it's also important from a policy and political perspective. So just quickly on what the group has achieved so far. In 2018, we did submit recommendations on refugee statistics, which were endorsed. It was followed by recommendations on IDP statistics in 2020. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we're now waiting in excitement for the UN Statistical Commission when the statelessness recommendations will be discussed. These are the indicators that the refugee recommendations are covering. So all important indicators in terms of also learning more about integration, well-being, how we fare in relation to age and sex disaggregation on refugees. Just quickly on
just if you don't mind just wrapping up quickly so we can go on to the next slide.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Thank
also
you.
Thank you, Heather. Also from the group, we have a list of 12 priority indicator for disaggregation. Not going into all of them here, but also important to note that the recommendations is to improve sex and age disaggregation on these important indicators, but also make sure that they are disaggregated according to migration status. Just to wrap up quickly on the priorities for the group going forward, continue working on the promotion and dissemination. There is a website for interested colleagues who want to visit that. There is also ongoing capacity building work in the 2 years to come, and there will be much sharing around this work. There is an e-learning course that interested colleagues can join. There is also additional work on more methodology guidance on how to work related to methodology and guidance, and we have identification questions and guidance around that. And also lastly, but not least, the work on the statelessness statistics recommendation that is now going to be discussed in the UN Statistical Commission. So with that, over to you, Heather, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate the presentation, and I think it's excellent to hear about the work of the group. I think everyone will definitely have their eyes on this at the upcoming Statistical Commission. I know I certainly will. So thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation. Next, we will turn to Sarah Viviani, who is a statistician at the Food and Agricultural Organization, working in the area of food security assessments for the last 10 years. And she will provide us with some new insights related to gender data and food insecurity. So I will pass the floor to Sarah now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be part of this panel. Let me share my screen. So can you see the presentation correctly? Okay. So I think as Heather correctly said, I'm a statistician, let's say, from more from a methodological and let's say mathematical point of view. So I'm in charge of the computation, the update, and methodological development for SDG 2.1.2 indicator. So today I'm going to give you some insights on what it has been done, what it has been published, and what are the main results, but also the ways forward in terms of estimates of food insecurity in a gender perspective. So just a few words on the tool that is used. So in order to estimate the SDG indicator 2.1.2, that is the prevalence of food insecurity at moderate or severe levels, we use the so-called food insecurity experience scale survey module. So exactly the objective is to estimate the proportion of people in the population facing food insecurity. So those who don't have adequate access to food at different levels of severity. So the innovation here is to not only to look at the population that face severe hunger, but also more moderate levels of food insecurity. The module is composed of 8 questions, and usually, I mean, there are different versions, but the typical module has simple dichotomous responses, so yes or no, and then there is also the possibility to reply I don't know or refuse. And the idea is to try and capture through these questions experiences that are associated with limited ability to obtain food. So essentially the idea is to have a tool like for example, when a medical doctor asks for symptoms for a specific health issue, we use let's say questions, experiences that are associated with the inability to access food, with the idea that food insecurity, access to food is not something that you can directly observe, but you can observe some manifestations, some experiences and that we try to capture through these questions. Through a set of these of questions, there is a range of severity. So basically, each question is located along a latent trait of food insecurity that can go from a mild condition to a more severe condition. And along this continuum of severity, also respondents, of course, are located. So the goal is exactly to locate respondents along this continuum. Even though some questions are, let's say, also capturing the dimension of quality of food, the aim is not to assess the quality of the diet, but rather to capture one of the conditions that may also be related to quality in the access to food. And from the methodological point of view, the model that is implemented is called the RUSH model, and there are a set of tools within item response theory that we apply in order to ensure reliability, validity, and cross-country and over time comparability of the results. So exactly as I was saying before, this is the representation of the continuum of food insecurity. There are some questions that refer to uncertainty, to the ability to obtain food, that can be located more on a mild level. Other questions that are related to food quality and variety. And then when we go towards a more severe condition, there are questions that relates to reduce the reducing food quantities or skipping a meal, and in at the very severe hand, we have the experience of hunger and not having been able to eat for 1 or more days. This is the survey module. I don't want to go into each question separately, also because, as I said, the approach is not to analyze each of the questions separately, but to analyze them in a scale, in the form of a scale. So each of the questions contribute to the measure of food insecurity, but is not analyzed separately from the others. The only aspect that I wanted, that I would like to highlight is that when it comes to disaggregation at the level of, for example, gender, the questions should be individually referenced, and we will, dig into this aspect later in the presentation. But of course, in the moment in which you would like to have a statistic that is disaggregated, you need to, by gender, you need to target individual respondents and possibly have surveys that, in terms of sampling design, allows to have a random sample of men and women. So in terms of data sources, there are many different contexts in which the FIES is applied at national level. One very interesting vehicle is the Gallup Purple, and within this vehicle, the FIES is administered at individual level. And also the sampling frame is targeting individuals. And also the post-stratification weights are built in order to replicate the gender, the structure, the national structure by gender. So in this sense is one very useful data source in order to inform disaggregated statistics by gender, especially the food insecurity ones. So in terms of time trends, we have data from 140 countries since 2014. Now we are in the at the stage of processing 2022 data. Regional and global coverage is quite good, so usually data are available for more than 95% of the world population, and this makes quite easy to estimate the prevalence of food insecurity disaggregated by gender. But there are also other types of checks that should be done in order to ensure that basically the statistics are comparable between men and women. So there are some research papers that we are currently working on, and they are also publish that point to the need of using the proper tools in order to ensure essentially that not only to ensure, but in case they are not comparable, to adjust them in order to make them comparable. And this is, let's say, feasible from a methodological point of view. This is the figure that was published in SOFIT, in State of Food Insecurity in the World 2022, where exactly, as it was already mentioned, we can see that there was an increasing gender gap, especially between after the COVID-19 outbreak, that didn't at the global level didn't reduce even after. So in 2021 there is still let's say a continuation of this trend. And I'm just reporting here a focus on the global trends. also to show that another methodological effort has been to also try and associate with the statistic disaggregation, with the disaggregated statistics, also a measure of variability. So we so that we are able not only to say how much women have more issues in accessing food compared to men, but also whether, especially at country level, whether there is the statistical capacity to say that this difference is significant.
Hi, Sarah. Sorry, just to see if you can wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Okay, so there is something that just a report that I wanted to mention about the status of women in agri-food systems, where essentially I'm going to show only this map, where essentially it's shown. One of the results are depicting countries where the difference in access food between men and women is basically against, biased towards women, and where essentially this difference is not significant. In terms of data and information sources, for the first time last year we published disaggregated statistics by gender, not only in FAUSTAT but also in the UNSD database. It's already some years. So not only at regional level but also at country level. Then we have a catalog where we also include microdata. So not only from the Gallup poll, but also from other surveys whenever possible. So among the information that is provided, there are FIS questions, but also the variable gender, and a set of other demographic information, socio-demographic information. Then there is the SAFI publication that I was mentioning that is going to be published in the new edition in July 2023. And finally, just to mention that there is some quite productive research work in terms of peer-reviewed articles that explore geographical distribution, the determinants behind this gender gap, this not only the gender gap but also the trend. And then very recently we are also starting to use small area techniques, because in most cases the national surveys, large national surveys, include the FIS module, but they have a household sampling frame and a household version of the FIS. And so in this case we are trying to find some techniques in order to also made the estimation disaggregated by gender possible. So with that, I'm thanking you for your attention, and looking forward for a discussion. Over.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We are a little bit short on time, so I just want to give an opportunity for all of the presenters, the panelists, to answer some of the questions. Sarah, I just want to direct you to one that's in the chat. Does the FIES deal with acute hunger, and is it linked to the IPC food insecurity scale? If you want to just very briefly touch on that. And then there are some questions also in the chat that perhaps we can address directly in the chat. Otherwise, I will move on to the next two after your response, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, there is, let's say, over the last year, there was some increasing collaboration with the IPC. So now the FIS is formally included among the indicators that inform also IPC, and of course there is an adaptation. So it's not directly the SDG indicator that is included, but there is the other, I mean, other levels of severity of food insecurity are explored and included, because as you said, there is the need to monitor, let's say, very, very severe conditions. So, the SDG indicator is pointing to a milder, let's say, condition. But there is some material in this respect I can share with you all after the or in the chat right now.
Thank you, Sarah. So I just wanted to move to a question that will be for all of you, and perhaps we can start first with Aina. When doing research in SDG 5, are there frameworks we can use to make data collected more useful? They note that in the GRP symposium organized by UN Women last week, they mentioned that not all data that is being collected is useful. And or the flip side, why might there be a lack of data or of information for the statistics that you are also looking at? So if you wanted to address either of those, thank you. And then we can move to Antrev with the same question.
Do you want me to start, Heather?
Yes, please, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and I think that is something that we're also advocating strongly for in the Global Data Service in UNHCR, that you think carefully through which data to collect, and also have a clear plan for the objectives of how to or why you do it, and also how to use it, because as we know, it also puts some burden on the respondents when we do the data collection. In terms of frameworks, I mean, the as I mentioned in my talk, we now have a statistical framework for collection of data, but we also in UNHCR also have legal frameworks for the work and the mandate we do have. But I think again, just stressing that you think through the objectives of the data collection exercise, and have some key questions you want to answer, and also in close consultation with national partners to also make sure that it is of value for the people that we're supposed to work with and for. Then the second question, why it's difficult to find the relevant data. I think that's some of the points that we addressed in this call. We have not enough sex and age disaggregated data, and we see that in the area of refugee and IDP and statelessness statistics, that we need to further work with national partners to improve this. But before we even get to that point, in my area, we need to work with national partners to make sure that these populations are included in national statistics, that national partners also see the need to include forcibly displaced in their national statistics work, to see the need to have this data so that it can inform their policies, their planning, their global reporting. So I think what we're doing here is really to try to close that gap, the need at national level, but also at global level for the data. So I think it all comes back to communicating around the need for why we do it as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Antra?
Yes, thank you so much, Heather. I think Aina already mentioned some very great points about the issues that we face with the data, but just I won't say anything repetitive, but I just want to say that in terms of frameworks, we have to be very careful with where the data is coming from, how it's collected, what's the source of it, and what are the different conditions and stakeholders who were involved in its collection, because I think that even with all of the SDG indicators, if one goes to the SDG indicator database, and we're happy to share links about that, there's clear methodology available and frameworks available for data collection. And that's, I think, at the main helm of the work that the Statistical Commission also does. But now we have a lot of new data that are coming up in terms of big data or secondary data that people have started using, but there are no frameworks around those, and we do not really know what those data are telling us. Are they representative or not? So so on and so forth. So I think the point would have to be careful about who's involved in that data collection, how much information do they have about those data, and whether it was safely and properly collected. I think that's just an additional point from me. I also wanted to very quickly mention that I saw a couple of questions in the chat about indicator 5A, the land rights indicator. And I see that many of you are worried about the data, missing data on that. So I did want to mention that our UN Women's Women Count program has now a partnership with FAO to improve data on this particular indicator. And we are already seeing some improvement, because I think as of last year now, we have data on 32 countries, which is much larger than what we didn't have before on women's ownership of agricultural land, because now there has been an integration of the land ownership modules in the agricultural census and survey. So, we're doing a little bit as much as we can, but there are huge data gaps and we need more and more initiatives to fill in those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antra. If you'll all indulge us for just a couple more minutes, I just wanted to ask one last question to all of the panelists from what we saw in the chat also. Is there any good news or anything that you're seeing in your research that can point to kind of the light, or somewhere toward some good news, or some key findings or advice that you have, or final thoughts that you would like to share with us? I'd just like to give just a minute to each of you, and I'll start with Sarah, and then Aina, and then Antra. So.
Thanks a lot for trying to finish the meeting with some positive takeaways. From the food security point of view, for example, not in all regions, the gender gap is increasing. So, for example, in Africa, in 2021, it is reducing. Specifically then at country levels, we see different in different regions. We see different countries that are slowly reducing also the gender gap. So I would say there is of course now the point is also to try and understand whether this is the result of any policy. For this we don't have, let's say, the power to have this type of conclusions. So of course any ad hoc study would help, but that's all from my side. Over.
Thank you. Aina?
I think, well, as I also mentioned in my presentation, the global figure for forcibly displaced is passing the 100 million mark this year, which is nothing to celebrate. But in terms of interest that with country level and with national partners, I think we see some optimistic developments in terms of national statistical offices and national statistical system wanting to include forcibly displaced in their statistics. So wanting to know how many they are, also wanting to know how many are women, how many are men, and also wanting to know how they're doing in terms of well-being and in terms of integration. And I think that's something positive in terms of knowing how many and how they're doing will also hopefully lead to some changes in terms of policy and programming and improvements in that area. And I think that's what we're advocating for as well, that you have to include these populations into statistics to be able to see some positive developments in the area as well. So I think that's maybe the most positive note from my side. In addition, that I mean, in the expert group, we have great collaboration with a number of national partners and statistical offices, and also seeing a great interest and also wanting to build capacity and understanding in the area. But in terms of the reporting and in terms of the overall figure, no, I would say no. But yeah, so a little bit of both here.
No, thank you so much. Antra?
Yes, I'll try to keep it to 30 seconds. But yes, I think that in terms of the bright spots in the data collection, we do see that it was improving over time. We have new partnerships coming up, but with the pandemic, things did slow a bit. So that set us back a lot in terms of data collection, simply because the surveys couldn't happen, or people are still trying to get back to normal life. But in terms of the outcomes, I would say prior to COVID, we did see a lot of improvement. Let's say in education, we saw that girls' enrollment rates were getting better. We saw some improvements also in political participation, child marriage, FDM. All those trends show a downward trajectory. But let's be very careful, because with the pandemic, we saw spikes further on. So we would have liked to have good news, and we were seeing some good news before the pandemic. But with these, not just the pandemic, but also the crises around us with the war, climate change, we are seeing a lot of reversal even in terms of outcomes. So unfortunately, not a lot of good news to celebrate.
Thank you so much, Ansha. No, I think we struggle with that as well when we're providing the full global report on, there is such a strengthening of the statistical systems to really try to start to measure and look at these different areas, in particular gender, statelessness, food insecurity. And so that is a plus, but yes, we are not necessarily headed in the right direction. And so I just want to thank all of our panelists for your insightful presentations and the discussions. Also very much appreciate the participants' questions. These were excellent questions. And some of the panelists have also provided some responses in the chat. So I just will add in kind of the side event calendar for the Statistical Commission into the chat, and encourage you to also check out some additional events on citizen-generated data, small area estimation, things like this, before the big show starting on the 28th. So thank you all very much for joining us for this side event. And for your discussions. We really appreciate it, and wishing everyone a really lovely day and evening wherever you are. So thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.